Starting in the early 2010s, there seemed to be this shared desire to reinvent the character of Superman and what he represented as a superhero. Many casual audiences had a hard time connecting with Superman as they thought he was too powerful, naive, and optimistic, making him what some viewed to be a boring character. So for a period of time, we were just bombarded with the evil Superman trope, whether it be Elseworld stories from DC themselves, or other studios and IPs having a character with powers like Superman, who would sometimes portray themselves as heroic, but were actually sinister in nature or had some ulterior motive. This convinced a whole subsect of people that a version of Superman that is more evil and sadistic is the more interesting take. But it seems like the evil Superman archetype has finally reached the end of its lifespan, with shows like The Boys having wrapped up and the latest seasons of Invincible featuring Omni-Man's more redemption efforts. Although those are adaptations of comics that debuted 20 plus years ago and were not necessarily an attempt to hop on the trend of copying Injustice Superman or something. Injustice hasn't had a proper AAA entry in almost a decade, but it seems like a third installment is on the horizon. More notably, the success of James Gunn's Superman has proven that audiences are capable of latching onto a theatrical Superman that incorporates the traditional values and innate goodness of the Man of Steel. It's nice to see Superman become a leading figurehead for DC Studios and more specifically the DCU, essentially serving as the studio's MGM line logo for canonical DCU projects and actually having consistent appearances. It was a complete clown fest when it came to how the previous regime at Warner Brothers handled Superman during the DCEU era, widespread incompetence at its finest. After the release of 2017's Justice League, the studio had no clear direction for the Man of Steel. Henry Cavill never got another solo outing after his 2013 movie, and his appearances post-Justice League were relegated to just cameos, and most of them you couldn't even see his face. A large part of their reluctance to give Superman the spotlight came from a belief that the character wasn't relevant to modern audiences. The studio held discussions with high-profile Hollywood talent like J.J. Abrams and Michael B. Jordan about ways they could reinvent the character. Michael B. Jordan was set to develop a Black Superman project for HBO Max alongside his production company. It would have focused on Val-Zod, who comes from the version of Earth 2 introduced in the New 52. At the same time, however, J.J. Abrams and his production company Bad Robot were developing a theatrical Superman reboot. But instead of centering the story on characters like Val-Zod or even Calvin Ellis, who are alternate universe versions of Superman, they intended on casting a black actor to play Clark Kent/Kal-El. The movie was going to be written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and the story would have reimagined Superman as a black superhero during the Civil Rights era. Surprise, surprise, both of those projects went nowhere and were eventually cancelled.
I'm shocked.
I'm not gonna lie, the movie sounded like it was gonna be straight booty butt cheeks. I don't know why they didn't just turn the Michael B. Jordan Val-Zod project into a theatrical movie. He's a pretty big star and would have brought in at least some butts into seats, because to me, an Elseworlds project centered on a Val-Zod or Calvin Ellis type of character doesn't sound that bad in isolation, and could make for an interesting story if done correctly. The creatives would have multiple comic stories to pick and choose from for both characters. The problem is that these movie ideas were initiated by not knowing what to do with the mainline Superman they had at the time. They were essentially going to replace the DCEU Superman in the live action space. These pitches only work once you've established your intended interconnected version to mainstream audiences with multiple proven successes. You gotta let audiences get invested in the character if you want them to even remotely consider the idea of a different version. You gotta let it simmer.
You gotta let it simmer. It's got a moment where it has to simmer.
That's right.
You're not letting it simmer. You have to let it simmer.
A part of me wonders if this mentality of Superman not being suitable for modern audiences without some sort of reinvention stems from Zack Snyder's original plans for his Justice League trilogy. Because if we were in another timeline where things went according to plan, Discovery never merged with Warner Brothers, and the Black Superman concept was never brought up in some executive meeting, we would have had to endure at least one movie of Henry Cavill's Superman being depicted as evil, thanks to Darkseid. Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice planted the seeds for the threat that was coming to Earth, one that would compel Batman and Wonder Woman to form the Justice League after Superman's death.
Help me find the others like you.
Perhaps they don't want to be found.
They will. And they'll fight. We have to stand together.
There's the infamous Nightmare Flash Forward where the Parademons and Darkseid have taken over Earth. Superman is now working directly under Darkseid's control, and the Flash travels back in time to warn Batman of what's to come. The Ultimate Edition showed a scene of Lex Luthor using the Kryptonian ship to learn more about the Mother Boxes and Steppenwolf. Zack Snyder planned a 5-movie arc that would have comprised a Man of Steel, BVS, and a Justice League trilogy. Additionally, all of the League members would have gotten their own solo movies at some point, with Batman, Aquaman, The Flash, and Cyborg slated to get their entries after the release of Justice League, but before the end of the trilogy. The base story of the first Justice League film would have played out relatively the same, where the team resurrects Superman and defeats Steppenwolf. The sequel would have had Darkseid actually pull up to Earth after Lex Luthor deciphers the anti-life equation with the help of the Riddler. Luthor would have informed Darkseid that the only way to use the anti-life equation to control Superman was to kill Lois Lane, who would have been pregnant in the film. Lois is hiding in the Batcave, but Darkseid makes his way there and kills her before Batman could save her. By the time Superman arrives, Lois is already dead, causing him to succumb to Darkseid's control. The rest of Justice League 2 would have focused on the events leading up to the Nightmare scene where Batman, Cyborg, Flash, Deathstroke, Mera, and Joker are the last survivors and have to work together to steal a mother box. They want to combine its capabilities with the Cosmic Treadmill to allow the Flash to travel back in time and prevent the death of Lois Lane. You would have seen Superman kill the remaining characters, starting off with Batman just like how it was shown in the BVS scene. This new timeline created by Barry going back in time would have resulted in Batman sacrificing himself to save Lois from Darkseid. There would have been this huge fight where the entire pantheon of the New Gods, the Atlanteans, the Amazons, and the Justice League team up to fight Darkseid and his army. The third installment would have had an epilogue that jumps 20 years into the future, where Superman and Lois' son doesn't have any powers and becomes the next Batman. So you mean to tell me, the plan was to introduce Superman in an origin movie, kill him off in his second appearance, resurrect him in his third appearance, and in his fourth appearance / direct sequel to Justice League, make him turn evil and kill the rest of the heroes? This is the universe some of y'all want restored so badly?
Oh, wow. Wow. Wow.
Now, eventually, the DCEU Superman would have been depicted as the more hopeful Superman everyone is accustomed to in the long run. He would have been the main character in Justice League 3, holding the team together emotionally and leading the fight against Darkseid after Batman's death. Don't know why it would have taken 5+ movies to get to that point, but it is what it is. Henry Cavill even talked about wanting to play a more traditional version of the character. Some people nowadays like to dunk on Cavill as an actor, stating that he can't act or whatever, which is something I never really understood, as although I'm not too familiar with his other work, I thought he did a pretty good job as Superman, all things considered. Him and Ben Affleck were the best castings out of all the Justice League heroes, and if given a well-written script, we could have gotten a generational adaptation.
I felt like Man of Steel was a wonderful opening story, an origin story to Superman. It left a lot of space for him to grow beyond that and become the hero that we recognize. Batman v Superman took a hard turn down a darker route, and it was a Batman perspective story. And so it didn't really show the aspects of Superman, which I was very, very keen to show. Justice League Snyder Cut definitely lent into that a bit more. I had a bit more of a gentleness to the tone of the thing. But I would love to have the opportunity to play the Superman that we all know and love from the comics.
But the most notorious version of an evil Superman story is the Injustice video game series and its prequel comics. NetherRealm Studios collaborated with DC Comics to create the story for the first Injustice game, with the DC writers Justin Gray and Jimmy Palmiotti serving as story consultants to make sure the core characters kept their proper voices. The development team wanted to rationalize some of the gameplay mechanics through the story mode, explaining why major players in the DC universe would be fighting one another. It also served to justify how certain characters could go up against others who would typically be way more powerful than them in a fighting game context, so explaining how Green Arrow could fight Solomon Grundy, for example. The popularity of the Injustice franchise, thanks to the success of its 2 games and the prequel comic titles, has made it a point of intrigue for casual fans and those who were perhaps new to the DC IP. But this admiration for what seemed like a new, interesting take, despite evil Superman stories having been adapted many times prior to Injustice, added fuel to the public opinion of Superman being this boring character without some sort of grand deconstruction or making him downright evil. Zack Snyder himself took some inspiration from the Injustice game for his planned story and plotline for Justice League 2. I think another factor that went into the casual audience's admiration for Injustice Superman has to do with the track record of theatrical Superman films, despite more accurate depictions of the character being presented in several animated shows and movies. Because if I'm being honest, Superman has had more misses than hits when it comes to theatrical releases. There are only like 2 good live-action Superman movies if you're asking me. The rest are either aight or just downright awful. So it's really not that surprising as to why average people didn't latch onto Superman the way they did with Batman or Spider-Man for the longest time. For the next few years, DC went on to release several adaptations of the evil Superman archetype, including Injustice 2 and its prequel comic series. There were also a couple of animated films where Superman isn't entirely evil, but is portrayed as more aggressive or authoritarian in his methods, such as Superman Red Son, an adaptation of the 2003 miniseries, and Justice League Gods and Monsters, which features the son of General Zod taking on the Superman role. However, there seemed to be a bit of a shift starting around 2021. Superman and Lois debuted on the CW, a show focused on an older Superman and Lois Lane raising their twin sons Jonathan and Jordan Kent. You all need to watch that show if you haven't already, it's really good. And not too long afterwards, the Warner Brothers Motion Picture Group co-chairs allowed The Rock to include Henry Cavill's Superman in the mid-credit scene of Black Adam. Obviously this wasn't going anywhere as they hired James Gunn before the mid-credit scene was even filmed to write a Superman movie that was intended to be completely detached from the DCEU. Regardless, it demonstrated the studio's less reluctant attitude toward giving Superman the spotlight in theaters again. Which brings us to the current Superman played by David Corenswet in the DCU helmed by James Gunn. This man right here just perfectly embodies the role, down to his looks, the line delivery, his mannerisms, the chemistry with other characters. This is hands down some of the best casting for a major superhero role in recent years.
He is not just a man. He's not just a Superman. He is the prophet of the Lord!
You might like or dislike the movie or James Gunn's approach because everyone has different tastes, but you can't deny that this movie was generally liked by critics and audiences. It directly tackles and dismantles a lot of the criticisms and misconceptions about Superman among moviegoers, showcasing Superman's vulnerability both physically and emotionally, without needing to nerf his abilities or portray a level of stoicism that might come off as boring. Combined with David Corenswet's great performance, you have a version that is very warm, charming, and forthcoming with people. Someone who strives to see the good in everyone despite whatever circumstances he's in.
You trust everyone and think everyone you've ever met is beautiful.
Maybe that's the real punk rock.
That is being human, and that's my greatest strength. I hope, for the sake of the world, you understand that it's yours too.
Despite being a powerful alien, emphasizing that Clark grew up on Earth much like everyone else and fully experiences human emotions is a way for audiences to connect with him. Even if the wider public in-universe initially views Superman through a godlike lens, leaning too heavily into that perception can become problematic when portraying him as an inspirational figure and moral role model for humanity. Ideally, Superman should come across as friendly, compassionate, and approachable rather than a reluctant messiah or a Christ-like figure. His ability to inspire people is most effective when it stems from his humanity and empathy, instead of being placed on a pedestal as an untouchable savior.
You wanted Trunks in theory. You liked the idea of Trunks.
Theoretically, I like the idea of Trunks because it's, you know, Superman I grew up with.
But the problem is they look kind of silly. You were looking for a way to make them look cool, or you were looking for a function, an explanation for having them.
A reason why they would be there, yeah.
And my thing was just maybe they're supposed to look a little silly. Maybe the reason he wears them is to look a little silly, basically to undermine how powerful he really is.
Everyone knows he's an alien. He shoots beams out of his eyes. He can blow things down with his breath. He's sort of this terrifying creature, but he really likes kids and human beings and people, and he wants kids not to be afraid of him. And so that was the thing that made me decide to keep the Trunks.
The story of Superman is a metaphor for the everyman, but just on a Paul Bunyan scale. He has an everyday job, he has relatives that visit, and a dog he occasionally looks after. But in his case, it might be people from the 31st century and a superpowered Kryptonian dog that he takes for a walk on the asteroid belt. Superman should be the linchpin of any successful interconnected DC universe. If you can't get the character right or have the audience resonate with him in the first few entries, your entire universe and planned story is gonna fall apart, which is exactly why I'm okay with the DCU fleshing out the Superman mythos first and foremost, with Supergirl being the next theatrical film that showcases her origin, how she came into contact with Superman, and explores more of their Kryptonian heritage. Topple that with comic book elements die-hard readers would have dreamed of seeing on the big screen 10 to 15 years ago, things like the iconic power armor worn by Lex Luthor, his rivalry with Superman being properly fleshed out over the course of several projects, the inclusion of the Superman family with Supergirl and Krypto, even smaller things like the Daily Planet crew having some screen time and Jimmy Olsen actually having some significance in a Superman movie. In the previous universe, they turned Jimmy Olsen into a CIA operative and had him killed in the first 15 minutes of the second installment. That should tell you everything you needed to know with how the Superman mythos was going to be handled. Now Homeboy is getting his own TV show. Hopefully the continued success of the DCU will show future writers and creatives that the evil Superman trope is not the only way to make the character seem interesting or compelling. There have been some cool concepts in the past, and the idea itself isn't an issue. It becomes a problem when executives want to be lazy and use it as one of the excuses to not give us a mainstream traditional Superman adaptation, because they don't know how to tackle him. Because how much more interesting is Superman becoming evil really? Yeah, it's different from the status quo and whatnot, but Clark choosing not to succumb to grand cynicism, greed, or selfish desires is what makes him stand apart from the rest. It's the more difficult choice to lead with compassion. Being the most powerful superhero on the planet would raise concerns simply by virtue of his existence. Yet his actions and demeanor allow him to become one of the most beloved and trustworthy people on Earth, showing a level of restraint and care that is admirable. He still feels negative emotions, but they don't control him. That sense of rarity in society is why he has been and will remain a relevant superhero. He's been a mainstay in pop culture for nearly 90 years for a reason. Forget all that nonsense from previous WB execs on him not being relevant for modern audiences. The most recent film proved them wrong in spades. The fact that 12 years had gone by with no standalone Superman movie in theaters prior to 2025 speaks volumes. Let's not do that again. Evil Superman is a thing of the past that has become outdated and, ironically, is now the version that feels irrelevant to modern audiences. The future of Superman media is looking bright and could provide comic readers with a theatrical interpretation that has longevity, while also creating a new generation of Superman fans in the foreseeable future.